It was the kind of winter morning that made the world feel paused, quiet, still wrapped in fog, and the kind of cold that settled deep into the bark of the trees. On that morning, 9 winters ago, Thomas Reed found something he hadn't expected. Not a sign, not a trail marker. A sound, so soft it barely existed, like a whisper caught between frost and wind. Back then, Thomas was still in his early 60s, a retired forest ranger with no great plans and no great burdens. He lived in a modest cedarwood cabin, tucked behind a patch of long-leaf pines in western North Carolina, near a trail used more by deer than by people. His days were slow, steady. Bird seed on the porch, coffee by 6 long walks with no destination. That winter had been harder than usual. Ice came early. The trees were brittle and the sky never seemed to fully wake up. Most wildlife stayed hidden, but Thomas never lost the habit of keeping his eyes open for prints, broken branches, anything that said life passed through here. That morning he heard it just off the ridge. Not quite a cry, not quite a growl, more like a scrape of breath, a pulse of sound ragged and raw. He followed it careful, expecting maybe a wounded possum or a fox caught in barbed wire. Instead, he found a cub. A bobcat kitten, tiny, still spotted her ears too large for her face, and her ribs so sharp they almost shone through her coat. She was curled against the base of a tree stump, unmoving except for the way her eyes flicked upward when he approached. He didn't speak, just knelt down in the snow, slowly unwrapped the wool scarf from around his neck and scooped her up the way you might gather something breakable, something sacred. He named her Wren. Not because she looked like a bird, but because even then she had a wildness in her, and a song, faint and fleeting, that stayed with you long after it stopped. The first few nights, Thomas didn't sleep. Wren was too small to leave alone, too fragile to survive without warmth. He wrapped her in a towel and tucked her into a box lined with old flannel. She barely made a sound, just twitched sometimes in her sleep, like something in her still fought to escape whatever had nearly killed her. Her paw pads were raw from cold, her belly sunken. A puncture wound ran along her right flank, possibly from a hawk or a stray dog. The nearest wildlife rehab center was hours away and closed during storms. So Thomas did what he could. He gave her tiny drops of warmed goat's milk, cleaned her with a damp cloth. He even played soft music in the evening, not because she understood, but because he believed healing was easier in a gentle space. Wren didn't trust him at first. She hissed when he came too close, flinched when he reached for her food dish. But she never tried to escape, and after a week she stopped growling. After 2, she leaned her head against his palm. By the end of the month, she followed him, always a few steps behind as he made his rounds near the property. Never close, never tame, but not gone either. In that space between wild and safe, something new had formed. Not she ownership, not even companionship, just a recognition. Thomas never asked for her to love him, and he knew better than to call her a pet. Wren was bobcat through and through, cautious, proud, silent when you wanted sound, fierce when you expected calm. But she watched him closely. At sunrise, she waited by the porch, as if to see what his mood was. At night, she'd sit near the woodpile while he read by lantern light, her tail curled neatly over her paws like she had nowhere else to be. He'd lost his wife 2 years earlier, cancer slow and cruel. The house had been so quiet after that, even the birds seemed to sing more softly. But with Wren around, something shifted. There were still long silences, still hard days, but there was motion again, responsibility. Hope tucked in fur and tooth and claw. One night she climbed onto the porch while snow fell in heavy flakes. She sat beside him without sound, and for the first time Thomas reached out and brushed her back with the flat of his hand. She didn't pull away. He'd never call it love, but he'd remember that moment longer than most people he'd met. Wildlife rehabilitation, especially of predators, is usually a detached job. Feed them, heal them, release them. You're told not to get close. They're not meant to stay, but sometimes healing goes both directions. Wren's body mended, her coat thickened, her walk steadied. She stopped limping. By late March, the center in Asheville was ready to take her in. But when they saw how strong she'd become and how wary of other humans, they agreed she didn't need more care. She needed space. So Thomas opened the gate behind his property and let her walk. No ceremony, no final embrace. Just a pause at the tree line, a look back. Then she disappeared without a sound. Thomas waited at the porch for days. Sometimes he left food near the edge of the woods. It always remained untouched. By early April, he stopped leaving it out. Not because he'd forgotten her, but because the wild was where she belonged. And he had done what he was meant to do. Seasons passed. The trail overgrew. The box she once slept in was stored in the attic, still lined with old flannel. Life went on slowly, peacefully. But sometimes when the wind moved just right through the trees, Thomas thought he could still hear that first sound, the barely there rasp of breath that had changed everything. Until one day, years later, the sound came again. But this time it wasn't weakness that brought Wren back. It was memory. Have you ever let something go and hoped it might remember you? If so, share a memory. Or just leave a... Someone out there might need to see it. It had been nearly a decade. Long enough for the trails to shift, for fences to rot, for memories to fold themselves into the quiet corners of the heart. Thomas Reed hadn't spoken her name in years. But one gray morning in late October, just before the first frost, the forest answered him. That day began like any other. Thomas had brewed coffee early, black and slow, then layered on a worn flannel shirt. The trees behind his cabin rustled gently, not with wind, but with the restless hush that comes before weather turns. He'd planned to walk a short trail behind the property, the one that wound down past the old rock bed where wildflowers used to grow thick in spring. These days his knees didn't care for steep climbs, but the gentle incline still welcomed him. About 30 minutes in, near the spot where pine gave way to sweet gum, something made him stop. Not a sound this time, a presence. The way the stillness shifted. The feeling you get when you're not alone, but whoever shares the moment with you hasn't decided yet if you're friend or threat. Then he saw her. At first, just a flicker movement behind the brush. A figure crouched low to the earth. Gaunt, unsteady eyes rimmed with weariness. He thought it might be a coyote or a dog. But when she stepped into the clearing, every bone in his body knew. Even after all these years, even after all that time, it was Wren. Wren was different now. Bigger, scarred, lean from years in the wild. Her coat was no longer soft gold, but streaked with dust and weather. One hind leg dragged slightly as she moved, a limp she hadn't had before. Dried blood darkened her shoulder. Her left ear was torn as if she'd escaped something. Barely, but the eyes, they were still hers. Golden, steady, and locked on to him, not with fear but familiarity. Not like prey looking at a predator, but like a traveler recognizing a lighthouse on a shore they thought had long vanished. She didn't approach right away, just stood there breathing hard, her sides rising and falling like bellows. Thomas didn't speak. He just crouched down slowly, careful not to startle her. He opened his palm and waited. Wren took one step, then another, and then she collapsed. Thomas rushed forward. She didn't resist, not a hiss, not a growl. She let her head rest against his boot, her body trembling. He saw now the wound along her flank, deep raw, possibly from a snare. There were puncture marks, too. Could have been a territorial fight. Another bobcat, maybe a mountain lion, hard to say. He pulled off his coat and wrapped her as best he could. The old wool still smelled faintly of pine soap and wood smoke. Maybe that scent stirred something in her. She let him carry her. Back at the cabin, he placed her in the same flannel-lined box she'd once outgrown. She barely stirred, just pressed her face into the cloth and exhaled like someone finally home. The past doesn't often come back to us whole. More often it drifts in pieces, a familiar scent, a half-remembered song, a trail you thought had vanished. But this was different. This was a choice. Wren hadn't stumbled into his life by chance. She'd come back, wounded, yes, but not broken, and not lost. And somehow she had found her way through 10 square miles of unpredictable forest, straight to the cabin where healing had once begun. For Thomas, the moment felt less like a reunion and more like a circle closing. As if kindness, when quietly given, sometimes loops back in forms we least expect, not for repayment, but to remind us it mattered. Science tells us that animals remember through scent and sound. Studies suggest bobcats, though solitary, can recall specific people, especially those tied to care or safety. It's not memory in the way we define it. It's deeper, less cognitive, more cellular, a knowing stored not in thought but in feeling. There are stories unproven but persistent of wild animals returning to places of peace when injured, of foxes limping home, of birds nesting again on the same windowsill. They don't always stay, but they remember. Wren's return wasn't just biology. It was choice. Some might say instinct brought her back, but Thomas believed it was something quieter, recognition, not just of place but of heart. That first night, Thomas barely slept. He sat on the old rocker near the fire, the box beside him. Wren's breathing was shallow. Every few hours he offered her water with a small sponge. She licked it weakly. He spoke to her in the same soft tone he once used, more for his sake than hers. "You came back, little wild thing," he whispered. "You made it home." Outside, the wind picked up. Pine needles tapped softly at the windows. Inside, everything was still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just one man and one creature, both older now, both marked by time sharing warmth in a world that had changed around them. By morning, she was still breathing, and Thomas knew what came next. Not just rest, not just watching over her. She needed help he couldn't give alone. He reached for his phone and dialed the only person he trusted with her life, a voice from the past, steady and kind. "Caroline," he said. "She's back. It's Wren, and she needs you. Have you ever been remembered by someone or something you thought had forgotten? If so, tell us. Or leave her if words feel too small. This is a place where quiet stories matter." She was still breathing, but it was shallow, each rise of her chest a question. Thomas had seen wounded animals before. But watching Wren, now the bobcat he'd once cradled in a wool blanket years ago, something inside him shook loose. This time he wasn't sure if he was saving her, or if holding on would be the thing that broke him. By midday, Thomas had driven her to the small wildlife clinic just outside of Boone, a place where the mountains folded into one another and the road wound through quiet ridges, like a ribbon of memory. It had been years since he last called Caroline Voss. She still picked up on the first ring. Caroline had once been the region's lead wildlife vet, sharp mind, soft voice, hands steady as stone. She and Thomas had worked together on dozens of cases before he retired. But Wren had always been different. Back then, Caroline warned him gently, "She's not yours to keep," and he never tried to. But here they were again, full circle. Caroline met them in the gravel lot behind the clinic. No questions, just a long look at the bundle in his arms. "Let's get her inside." The next 3 days blurred. Wren was in worse shape than Thomas had guessed. Deep puncture wounds along her side, a torn ligament in the back leg, old scar tissue from a fight long past. But the worst part was the infection. It had spread. Fast. Caroline moved with quiet purpose, these fluids, slow-release antibiotics. She stitched the worst lacerations, wrapped the leg, cleaned the wounds twice daily. She never rushed. She never spoke above a whisper. Thomas never left the clinic. He slept in an old camp chair just outside the enclosure, flannel blanket draped over his knees. He fed Wren bits of ground venison, softened in broth water, through a sponge. Spoke her name gently when her ears twitched in pain. At one point she tried to stand, collapsed again. She didn't growl. She didn't fight. That more than anything terrified him. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists when you're waiting for something to survive. It's not loud. It doesn't demand. It just sits beside you, fills the corners, draws the breath slower. Thomas had thought he'd known love. He'd been a husband, a friend, a caretaker to countless wild things. But this was different. Wren wasn't his. Never had been. But in those long nights, she became something else. Not property, not a memory, a mirror. He saw in her the same stubbornness he carried, the same weariness, the same longing to choose life, but only on her terms. People often talk about animal rehabilitation like it's science, and part of it is wound care, nutrition, containment protocols, antibiotic resistance. But what's harder to measure is trust. Caroline explained it over tea on the second night. Wild animals don't come back to people unless they associate them with safety. Bobcats aren't like dogs. They don't imprint. They remember safety, smells, sounds, kindness. She paused. That means she came back not because she needed something, but because she remembered someone. It was a quiet kind of loyalty, the soulful kind. On the fourth day, Wren opened her eyes fully. Not fogged, not dazed, focused. Thomas was dozing, a book open across his chest. He felt something, a shift in the air, and looked up. She was watching him. And then she chuffed, low, raspy, the same sound she used to make as a cub when she wanted to be near but didn't know how. Caroline stood nearby. "She remembers you," she said softly, ease shining. "After all this time." Wren licked Thomas's knuckles when he reached through the mesh. That night, Thomas sat alone on the back step of the clinic with a cup of tea gone cold. He thought about everything he'd been taught about boundaries, the importance of keeping wild animals wild, about how letting them grow attached could be a form of harm. But what if the animal chooses the bond? What if the wild returns, not out of weakness, but out of trust? He had no answers, only questions, and a growing feeling in his chest that maybe the lines between human and animal weren't as clear as they seemed. Maybe what mattered wasn't taming, but remembering. By the end of the week, Wren stood on all fours, unsteady but upright. Caroline said it would take weeks, months, even before she could return to the forest. But Thomas saw something in her posture. She wasn't waiting to leave. She was watching him, as if she'd made her choice. And soon that choice would begin to shift everything, not just for Wren, but for the life Thomas thought was settled. Has an animal ever helped you heal in ways words never could? Tell us, or Levi, for all the wild hearts that came back. She could leave. By the third week, her wounds were closed. Her gait, though uneven, was strong enough to return to the trees. But Wren didn't go. Not far, at least. She stayed close, not caged, not called. Just there, like something watching over a home she once knew and had quietly chosen again. Most bobcats, once healed, vanish back into the forest. It's in their nature, elusive, solitary, fiercely self-reliant. They don't linger near people. They don't look back. But Wren did. Each morning, Thomas found her near the tree line behind the clinic, where the meadow gave way to taller brush. She never approached the other humans, not even Carolyn. But when Thomas came outside to feed the crows, to water the edge of the garden, to sit in the sun with a cup of tea, she would appear. Not asking, not waiting, just present. A rustle in the grass, a shadow along the fence, a pair of golden eyes watching softly. And when the sky dimmed and the light pooled low across the ridges, Wren circled back toward the cabin. She never slept inside, but she curled beneath the porch like she belonged to the place. Or maybe like it belonged to her. Wildlife rehabilitation comes with an unspoken code. Do your part, then let go. Animals aren't meant to become dependent. They need space, instincts, distance. That's how they survive. But there are exceptions, rare, complex, impossible to chart. Some animals don't return to the wild out of inability. They return to people not out of fear, but recognition. Caroline had seen this only twice in her career. The first was a fox who refused to leave the edge of the property after an injury. The second was Wren. "She's not behaving like she's trapped," Caroline said one evening watching Wren through the office window. "She's free to go. She just isn't." Thomas didn't reply. He just nodded, because he understood. Some beings aren't here to be studied. They're here to teach. To offer a presence that doesn't demand understanding, only respect. One morning, not long after Wren began staying by the porch, Thomas walked the back trail as he used to, the one that curved around the low ridge above the creek. It wasn't a long walk, just enough to stretch his legs, hear the soft percussion of the forest. Wren followed, at a distance. She didn't trail directly behind him, but she kept him in her sightline, weaving silently through the underbrush like a breeze that had shape. When Thomas stopped to rest on a fallen log, Wren perched nearby, half hidden in fern. He didn't call her, didn't even look over, but she stayed. And when he stood again, she rose too. The rhythm of their steps wasn't synchronized, but there was something in the space between them, a quiet companionship. Not forced, not named, just real. Thomas often thought of his late wife during those walks. She used to say there were two kinds of quiet, the kind that aches and the kind that heals. Wren had become the second kind. Her presence didn't fill the silence. She didn't erase the grief, but she gave shape to the hours that used to feel so long. And there's something healing in being watched over by something wild. Something that has every reason to leave but chooses to remain. Something untamed and yet loyal. In animal behavior studies, there's a term called liminal space. It refers to the psychological threshold between two worlds, between wild and domestic, between retreat and trust. Wren had taken root in that space. She wasn't captive. There were no walls, no enclosures, no leash, no collar. But she also wasn't wild in the traditional sense. She no longer roamed as far. She didn't hunt as often. She lingered. Biologists might call it unusual. Some might question if it's right. But sometimes the soul knows what the field guide can't explain. One evening, Thomas sat on the porch just before dusk. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves. A storm had passed earlier, and the sky was still heavy with color. He was reading not anything deep, just an old collection of nature essays, the kind his wife used to enjoy. He looked up to find Wren sitting 10 feet away, head turned slightly, tail curled beside her paws. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the light through the trees, watching the wind lift the edge of the world. Thomas didn't speak. But in that moment, something inside him softened. This wasn't about a pet and its person. It wasn't about survival. It was about presence. Two beings, both older, now both scarred, finding stillness beside each other, choosing not to leave. For viewers watching who've lost something, a partner, a rhythm, a part of themselves, this kind of story doesn't fix the ache, but maybe it offers something quieter, a reminder that love comes in many shapes, that loyalty isn't always loud, and that even in our most isolated moments, there may be eyes watching us with recognition, not to take, not to demand, just to say, I remember you. Wren continued to stay. She guarded the porch, shadowed Thomas's walks, slept beneath the stars as if the land was hers again. But the forest is never still for long. And the bond between them, though steady, was about to be tested in a way no one could have expected. One afternoon, not far from the trail they always walked, danger came, coiled in silence. And Wren would make a choice that rewrote everything. Have you ever found peace in a presence you didn't expect? Share your story. Or leave for the guardians who don't wear names. Some moments arrive without warning, no roar, no signal, no time to choose, just a breath, a sound in the leaves, and the quiet realization that the next few seconds might change everything. It was late afternoon. The air was thick with summer's last heat, and the light slanted golden through the trees, catching on dust and old spiderwebs like soft thread. Thomas had taken to walking the ridge trail again, slowly, carefully. His joints protested these days, but the habit was worth the ache. Wren followed as she often did now, half seen, always present, never far. She didn't shadow him tightly. She moved with her own rhythm, sometimes pausing to sniff a tree root or to study the sky when a hawk passed overhead. That day, Thomas stepped off the main path just slightly to pick up a fallen branch, blocking the trail. As he bent forward, hand outstretched, boot shifting over soft soil, he heard it. A rattle, not loud, but close. He froze. Just feet away, coiled beneath a patch of low fern, a timber rattlesnake waited. Its body thick scales patterned like bark and sun. Its head lifted, eyes locked. Strike position. He didn't have time to step back, but something else moved first. From the ridge above there was a blur of motion, A snap of sound, not like a branch, but like fur cutting through air. Wren leapt fast, silent, powerful. She landed between Thomas and the snake claw's bared growl rising from deep in her chest. The kind of growl that didn't ask questions. The kind that said, "This is mine to protect." The snake struck. Once, a flash of fang, a whip, fast snap of the neck. Wren yelped short and sharp, but she didn't back away. She slashed again, sending the snake retreating into the underbrush. And then she staggered, sat back on her haunches, and fell. Timber rattlesnakes aren't known to bite unless provoked, but when they do, their venom can cause severe swelling nerve damage, even death in smaller animals. Wren, though strong, was still recovering. The bite landed just beneath her thick neck fur, not deep, but enough. Thomas knelt beside her, hands trembling, his breath caught somewhere between panic and disbelief. She was panting, eyes open, alive. He scooped her into his arms, whispered something not words, more like a plea, and began the slow, careful walk back to the clinic. Every step felt like an hour, but she didn't fight him. She just laid her head against his chest and closed her eyes. When someone or something stands between you and danger uninvited without hesitation, something shifts in the soul. Thomas had saved Wren once, but she had never owed him anything. And yet here she was, choosing him. In a world where wild creatures are taught to flee to protect themselves first, Wren had gone against instinct, not to survive, but to shield. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't training. It was loyalty. And love, not the sentimental kind, but the kind that arrives without needing to be named. Science tells us that animals have protective behaviors, especially in social species. But bobcats aren't social. They're independent, solitary, born to survive alone, which makes acts like this hard to categorize. Caroline said it best hours later as she treated Wren with anti-venom and fluids. "This isn't typical," she whispered, wiping a bit of blood from Wren's paw. "This wasn't instinct. This was something else. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's connection. Maybe it's that somewhere, even in the wildest heart, there's a place that remembers kindness and chooses to return it." Wren's recovery took longer this time. Her body had already been pushed to its edge. The venom set her back, fever, weakness, long nights of shallow breath. Thomas never left her side. He sat near her crate in the clinic, whispering softly old songs, bits of stories, his hand resting just near enough for her to nuzzle if she chose. And sometimes she did. Caroline caught one of those moments on her phone, Wren lifting her head weakly, nudging Thomas's palm, her golden eyes fluttering half shut with trust. No filters, no editing, just a man and the creature who'd saved his life. The video didn't go viral, but it found the right people, the ones who needed to see it. Word spread locally. A story like this, quiet but fierce, has a way of rooting itself in people's hearts. Kids from the local school sent drawings. A woman who had lost her husband to cancer mailed a letter saying Wren reminded her of the dog who never left his bedside. A retired teacher visited the clinic and left a feather on the porch. "For her," she said, "because she remembers." People didn't come for entertainment. They came to feel something true. The story of Wren and Thomas wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about devotion. About the kind of love that crosses the line between human and animal, not in a way that erases wildness, but in a way that honors it. Weeks passed. Wren grew stronger. Her coat thickened again. Her eyes cleared. But she was different now. More patient, more still. She no longer simply stayed at the edge of Thomas's world. She stepped into it, chose it. And as the seasons turned, she began to walk the land not as a guest, but as a guardian. As if her story wasn't finished yet. As if she still had a role to play. Has anyone, human or animal, ever stood between you and harm without being asked? Tell us. Or leave her for the protectors in your life, silent or spoken. It started with a single story shared quietly, almost reluctantly, over a mug of coffee at the local feed store. A bobcat who came back. A man she never forgot, and a moment in the woods that felt more like a vow than an accident. From there, the story did what all true stories do. It found its way into hearts that needed it most. In small towns, word spreads differently than in cities. It doesn't shout. It lingers in barbershop talk and church potlucks, in the pause before someone says, "You're not going to believe this." But that was how it began in the mountain town just below Thomas's Ridge. A quiet murmur about the bobcat who waited years to return. Then the part where she protected the man who once saved her. And then the part where she lived. It reached people who hadn't believed in much lately. Not in miracles, not in connection, not in anything that didn't come with a screen or a price tag. And suddenly something ancient stirred. The first letter arrived in a weathered envelope, no return address. Inside, a short note written in careful cursive. "When I lost my husband last spring, I thought I'd never feel protected again. But your story made me remember our dog Ranger. He used to sleep by the door every night like a soldier. I'd forgotten how that made me feel. Thank you for reminding me." She signed it simply Nancy, 73. Then came more. Crayon drawings from school children, feathers left on the clinic porch, a jar of hand-picked wildflowers tied with a string with a tag that read, "Tell her the whole town is rooting for her." A young boy named Caleb, no more than 9, asked if he could help feed the birds near the clinic. "My mom says we can't have a cat," he whispered, "but maybe I can help yours." For Thomas, it was both beautiful and bewildering. He hadn't meant for any of it to be public. He never chased attention. But somehow Wren had become a kind of message, not in what she did, but in what she was. A bobcat, fierce, wild-scarred, who had every reason to stay hidden, but who came back, chose connection, protected it. There was no spectacle, no trick, just something deeply honest. And that, it seemed, was what people had been aching to remember. That love doesn't always look like what we expect. And sometimes the wild is not something to tame, but something to trust. Caroline, who'd been so long steeped in clinical science and protocol, found herself rethinking old lines. During an interview for a local newsletter, she said, "We used to assume wild animals operated only on instinct, that any attachment was a fluke. But this bond between Thomas and Wren, it defies that logic. And I think maybe that's the point. Some things aren't meant to be categorized, only witnessed." The article spread. Not fast, not flashy, but steadily, like rain soaking deep into dry earth. A documentary student from Asheville reached out asking to film a short piece. "I'm not chasing viral," she said. "I just want to help people feel again." Thomas was hesitant, but Caroline nodded. "Let them see," she said. "Not because it's news, but because it's true." The town trail committee voted unanimously to rename the wooded loop behind the clinic. They called it Wren's Walk. A simple sign was carved by hand and placed at the entrance, nothing fancy. Just in honor of the bobcat who remembered. Visitors began walking it not in crowds, but in ones and twos. Older couples, veterans with service dogs, children holding hands with grandparents. They paused at the bench where Thomas often sat. Some left feathers or smooth stones. Others left nothing, only silence. But that too was part of the ritual. And occasionally, if they were lucky, they'd see her. Wren watching from the tree line. Not hiding, just observing. A presence that didn't seek praise, only peace. For many who heard the story, something softened. People who had long believed their kindness was forgotten started to believe maybe it wasn't. That maybe, like Wren, what they gave quietly to the world could find its way back. Not in big ways, but in feather-light moments. One man, recently widowed, emailed the clinic asking if he could sponsor food for Wren. "She reminds me of my wife," he wrote. "Strong, silent, always watching, always protecting, even when no one noticed." As the months passed, Wren stayed. Her limp faded, her strength returned, but she no longer roamed far. She paced the edges of Thomas's life like a sentry, not confined, not claimed, a guardian in her own right. And as the seasons shifted once again from golden fall into the hush of winter, something else began to change. Not in Wren, not in the town, but in Thomas. A quiet slowing, A new kind of stillness, not from grief, not from fear, but from a heart preparing gently for goodbye. Have you ever watched a story ripple out and change more than just the people in it? Share what stayed with you. Or leave if the world feels a little softer now. The end doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly in the hush between two breaths, in the flicker of a lantern nearly burned out, in the steady rhythm of a heart, simply choosing to rest. It was early October when the leaves began to fall faster than they could be raked, and the mornings came cool enough to frost the edges of the porch rail. Thomas had started sleeping with an extra blanket, the kind his wife had knit before she passed a moss-green quilt that held in more than just warmth. That week he moved slower, his steps less sure, his hands lingering longer on the doorknob. He never complained, never said the word, tired, but his body spoke it quietly. He made tea with more honey, took shorter walks, and on 2 separate mornings, he forgot to fill the bird feeder, something he'd done every day for nearly 12 years. Wren noticed. She began curling closer to the cabin, sleeping just beside the screen door, instead of under the porch. Her eyes followed him more often, her movements slower, mirroring his. No one said it out loud, not even Caroline. But everyone knew Thomas was preparing, and Wren, somehow, knew too. We often imagine the end of life as a distant, dramatic event, but for many, especially those who've made peace, it comes as a gradual fading, a soft stepping back, like the tide retreating quietly from the shore. For Thomas, there were no hospitals, no machines, just home, and Wren never left his side. Each morning she waited by the back door. Each evening she paced the edge of the garden until the light dipped low. She never came inside, but she didn't need to. One night just before the first frost, Thomas left the kitchen window cracked, something he hadn't done in years. Wren climbed through. Caroline came by the next morning to check on him. She'd started bringing homemade bread on Saturdays, an excuse to stay close without making a fuss. She knocked, no answer. She let herself in, calling softly, and followed the smell of cedarwood and peppermint oil, Thomas's familiar blend. She found him in his bed, the quilt pulled up to his chest. His face calm, his breath stilled. Wren was curled beside him, her great head resting on his chest, eyes closed. At first, Caroline thought she was just sleeping, but when she reached down, she felt it. No pulse, no breath, not even resistance. Wren had gone too. There's a kind of love that doesn't need words, that doesn't rise in grand declarations or loud goodbyes. It simply stays. What Wren and Thomas shared wasn't a pet and owner relationship. It wasn't explainable by roles or names. It was a bond, soulful, quiet, sacred. In a world often too loud to hear such things, they found a rhythm that needed no explanation. And maybe in the end, Wren chose to follow not out of sorrow, but out of wholeness, because her work was done. Because his was too, because neither one had to be alone. Animal behaviorists hesitate to label emotions like grief in non-human species. But again and again, stories surface of elephants who return to bones, dogs who sleep on graves, birds who wait at windows long after their mate has flown. Science calls it anecdotal. But for those who've witnessed it, it's something more. Caroline, through tears, said it best, "I've stitched broken wings. I've healed wounds, but I've never seen an animal choose to die beside someone. That wasn't instinct, that was devotion. And perhaps there are moments rare and holy when the boundary between species softens, and something deeper steps in. The staff at the clinic held a small memorial, just a few people, a quiet afternoon, and the old wind chimes Thomas had hung on his porch years ago. They buried them side by side, just beyond the garden fence, beneath the tallest pine on the hill. The spot caught the first morning light and overlooked the woods where Wren once hunted. A local woodworker carved a simple stone. Thomas and Wren, no dates, no titles, just truth. People came not in crowds, but steadily. A school teacher left a small bundle of feathers. A child placed a painted stone shaped like a bobcat's paw. A woman in her 80s whispered a prayer and traced their names with her fingertip. No one spoke loudly. No one needed to. Sometimes at dawn, mist clings low to the trees, And folks say they've seen a shape near the pines, an older man walking slowly, hands tucked in his coat pockets. And just behind him, a bobcat with gold eyes, silent and sure. They vanish if you blink, but the feeling stays, because some stories don't really end. They linger, like warmth from a fire long after the flame is gone, like loyalty that walks beside you even when you can't see it. Have you ever felt someone's presence long after they were gone? If so, this space is for you. Leave her for a bond that lives beyond words. Some stories don't echo, they hum, quietly, steadily, long after the characters are gone. Not because of how they ended, but because of how they made us feel. In the months after Thomas and Wren passed, something unusual began to happen. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, just soft things, subtle. Visitors still came to the hill behind the clinic. Some arrived with folded letters. Others carried nothing but silence. But more and more often they started leaving feathers at the base of the memorial stone. Single feathers. Bundles. Feathers tied with string or painted with bobcat paw prints. No one organized it, no one announced it. It just began. And it didn't stop. Some left blue jay feathers. Others found barred owl. A few came from red-tailed hawks. No one knew for sure if the feathers were gathered or gifted by nature herself. But over time, they formed a soft wreath around the stone, as if the forest too had decided to remember. One morning, a local girl named Ella, no more than 10, visited with her grandmother. She stood quietly in front of the stone, then pulled a small object from her coat pocket. A stone painted gold with a red heart in the middle. For her, she said, because she didn't run away. Thomas and Wren weren't famous. There were no documentaries with voiceovers or gala fundraisers in their name. They didn't go viral. And yet they reached people in a way few stories ever do. Because what they shared was simple, timeless, and deeply human. Kindness. Loyalty. A return that was never owed. A love that didn't need to speak, and a farewell that honored the quiet truth between them. Their story became more than a tale of a rescued bobcat. It became a reminder that even wild things can choose connection, that love doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks quietly beside you, watches from the shadows, and stands between you and danger, without ever needing to be asked. Months after their passing, Caroline received a package in the mail. No return label, just a bundle wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. Inside, a hand-carved wooden figure of a bobcat sitting beside a lantern. There was a note, "I lost my son 2 years ago. We used to watch wildlife videos together before bedtime. I hadn't watched another since. Until yours. I didn't expect to cry, but I did. And then I smiled. Thank you for giving me back a piece of my heart." She kept the carving in the clinic's entryway, and every so often a visitor would notice it pause, linger, and feel something they couldn't quite explain. In the rhythm of daily life, laundry, groceries, emails, headlines, it's easy to forget what matters. We scroll, skim, survive. But now and then a story catches us off guard. It slows us down. It opens something we didn't know was still closed. It reminds us that we're still capable of feeling deeply, even if the world moves quickly. That we're still connected to nature, to memory, to each other. That small things can be sacred, the brush of fur, the tilt of a head, the flicker of a lantern at dusk. What Wren and Thomas left behind wasn't a spectacle. It was a trail of emotion. Gentle but lasting, a path not paved with applause but with intention. And for those who walked it, who are still walking it, that was enough. Maybe you're watching this from a quiet kitchen, maybe with a cup of tea or while folding laundry, or before bed, hoping to fall asleep with something good in your chest. And maybe somewhere in your life there's been a Wren, someone who stayed when they didn't have to. Someone who saw you clearly when you were tired, or grieving, or simply trying to hold things together. Or maybe you've been that for someone else. That's the beauty of these quiet, heartwarming stories. They remind us that the soulful things matter most. Loyalty, kindness, patience, and the gentle strength it takes to keep showing up for each other. whether in a bobcat's gaze or a loved one's hand on your shoulder. Even now, the trail behind the clinic is still called Wren's Walk. Children still visit, hoping to catch a glimpse of her spirit in the fog. Some say they feel watched over, not in a spooky way, but in a way that makes the woods feel less lonely. And the memorial, it's never overgrown. No one has ever seen someone tending to it, but it's always clean. Leaves swept, stones placed neatly, feathers in fresh circles. Some things perhaps are cared for by memory itself, or by the world when it's finally moved by something true. So maybe now is the right time to pause, to take a breath, to ask yourself gently, who or what have you never really forgotten? What wild loyalty has shaped your life quietly, faithfully, without ever needing thanks? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of love or loyalty, or the soulful pull of connection, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel for more heartwarming stories, moral tales, and moments that speak softly, but stay with you. And if you feel called to give not just thanks, but something tangible, consider tapping the Super Thanks button or using the link below to donate. Every contribution helps care for wild animals. Like Wren supports ethical wildlife rehabilitation and allows stories like this to continue reaching people who need them. You're not just watching a story. You're part of the legacy it leaves behind. Thank you for being here. You're never alone in the forest, not really. There's always someone watching from the tree line. Not to chase, not to claim, but to remember.